Everyone watching this crisis has been asking the wrong question. The question every analyst, every government, every news cycle has been organizing itself around is what Iran will do next, whether the IRGC will escalate or accept the deal, whether Pezeshkian's civilian faction can survive Vahidi's constitutional seizure, whether the blockade holds long enough to force a nuclear agreement before the oil wells begin shutting down permanently, whether the protests spreading across dozens of Iranian cities simultaneously will reach the threshold that ends regimes. All of those questions are real. All of them matter. And all of them are downstream of a question that almost no one is asking directly, because asking it directly requires acknowledging something that the Islamic Republic's entire constitutional architecture was designed to make unthinkable. Who is actually running Iran right now? Not who holds the title, not who appears on state television, not whose name is printed on the constitutional documents that describe the command authority of the Islamic Republic's supreme leader. Who is actually making the decisions? Who has the real authority? Who controls the coercive apparatus that determines what the Iranian state does when those decisions need to be enforced? Because the answer to that question is not the answer that any official Iranian source will provide. And the gap between the official answer and the real answer is the most dangerous space in the Middle East right now. More dangerous than the carrier strike groups. More dangerous than the nuclear stockpile. More dangerous than the IRGC's fast boats or coastal missiles or the mines sitting in storage facilities along the Gulf coastline. A nuclear-adjacent state with a legitimacy vacuum at its very top, with two armed factions fighting each other for control of that vacuum, with a popular uprising larger than anything since the revolution, and with an economy that is days from structural collapse, is not simply a country in crisis. It is a country in which the most dangerous possible outcomes become structurally more likely with every hour that the question of who is actually in charge remains unanswered. Stay with me. Because what has happened to the supreme leadership of the Islamic Republic, who moved into the vacuum it created, how the IRGC has turned that vacuum into the most audacious institutional power seizure in the 45-year history of the regime, and why the next 72 hours inside that vacuum may determine whether the Islamic Republic survives in any recognizable form, is the story that everything else in this crisis depends on. And the full weight of it has not yet landed anywhere. To understand the vacuum, you have to understand what the supreme leader actually is inside the constitutional architecture of the Islamic Republic. Not ceremonially, functionally. Because Ali Khamenei was not simply a figurehead who gave speeches and issued religious rulings while others ran the state. He was the load-bearing wall of the entire Iranian political structure. Every institution that matters in Iran, the IRGC, the judiciary, the intelligence services, the State Broadcasting Authority, the Assembly of Experts, the Guardian Council, derives its authority from a chain of legitimacy that runs through the Supreme Leader's office. Remove the Supreme Leader's functioning authority from that structure, and you do not simply create a leadership gap. You remove the institutional glue that holds the entire architecture together. Every decision that would normally flow through that office becomes contested. Every appointment that requires Supreme Leader authorization becomes a point of factional conflict. Every major state action that requires constitutional authority from the top becomes something that competing factions can block, redirect, or claim unauthorized. This is not theoretical. It is what is happening in Tehran right now, and it is happening at the worst possible moment, under the worst possible conditions, with the worst possible combination of external pressure and internal fracture that the Islamic Republic has ever faced simultaneously. Khamenei's medical condition has been the Islamic Republic's most closely guarded secret for months. State media has said nothing that would allow external verification of his actual status. The regime's communication architecture, which has spent 45 years managing information about the supreme leadership with extreme precision, has been conspicuously silent on the one question that every faction inside Iran and every intelligence service outside it is trying to answer. The silence itself is information. When a regime that controls its information environment completely goes silent on a specific topic, the silence describes a reality that the regime has concluded is more dangerous to acknowledge than to obscure. What informed sources, including Iran International, which has the deepest sourcing inside the Iranian political establishment of any external publication, have been able to document is this: the supreme leader is not functioning. The constitutional authority of the office is not being exercised by the person who holds it. The decisions that should flow from the top of the Iranian state are not being made by the supreme leader and cannot be made by the supreme leader because the supreme leader cannot make them. And into that vacuum, with the precision and speed of an organization that has been preparing for exactly this moment for longer than any public analysis has acknowledged, moved the IRGC. What Ahmad Vahidi has been doing since Khamenei's incapacitation became functionally complete is not as the Iranian government's diplomatic faction has been describing it, a policy disagreement between branches of government. It is a constitutional coup being executed in stages, in the open, in front of every faction in the Iranian state, with complete confidence that no existing institution has the authority or the coercive capacity to stop it. Vahidi has been blocking presidential appointments, filling intelligence ministry positions himself, outside the constitutional process that requires presidential authorization, pressuring the Supreme National Security Council toward alignments the civilian government did not authorize, absorbing executive functions that belong constitutionally to the elected presidency into the institutional structure of the Revolutionary Guards. But here is the layer of the power seizure that goes deeper than any of those specific moves. The layer that reveals what the IRGC is actually building inside this vacuum, rather than simply exploiting opportunistically. Mojtaba Khamenei, the supreme leader's son, has become the functional authority through which the IRGC is laundering the decisions it cannot make in its own name. In the constitutional architecture of the Islamic Republic, the supreme leader's authority is not transferable informally. It cannot be delegated to a family member without a formal succession process involving the assembly of experts. There is no constitutional provision for a supreme leader's son to exercise his father's authority during incapacitation. None. The imaginary approval that decisions are being attributed to Mojtaba Khamenei from his father's medical room is not a constitutional mechanism. It is a fiction, and the IRGC is using that fiction as the authorization for everything it is doing. Every appointment blocked, every ministry position filled without presidential authority, every executive function absorbed. Every decision made by Vahidi that constitutionally requires Supreme Leader sign-off is being attributed, through a chain of informal assertion, rather than constitutional process, to a man who has no constitutional authority to provide it. The most powerful military organization in Iran is governing the Iranian state on the basis of authorization obtained from a constitutional ghost. And it is doing this in plain sight of every faction in the Iranian political system, because it has calculated correctly that no existing institution has the standing, the authority, or the coercive capacity to call the fiction what it is, while the real supreme leader cannot speak for himself. Pezeshkian formally demanded that executive powers be returned to the civilian presidency. He used language that, within the context of the Islamic Republic, constitutes something close to a public accusation of treason against the organization that controls the guns. Vahidi refused. Not negotiated, not offered a compromise framework, refused. The constitutional demand of an elected president to the commander of the Revolutionary Guards was met with an institutional no that was not accompanied by any legal argument, any constitutional citation, or any process by which the dispute could be adjudicated, because the adjudication of such a dispute requires a functioning supreme leader, and the functioning supreme leader does not exist. Parliament Speaker Galibaf, who is not a member of the civilian reform faction and whose political history includes deep ties to the IRGC establishment, told advisors in a session reported by Iran International that senior IRGC-aligned figures were extreme militia-like actors who would destroy Iran. He said he feared being removed from his position. He worried that Foreign Minister Araki would be ousted. The Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, one of the most powerful constitutional figures in the Islamic Republic, is afraid of the organization he is supposed to help govern. That sentence, taken seriously, describes something that has moved beyond a political crisis into something more fundamental. An organization that the Speaker of Parliament fears, who will remove him from his constitutional position, is not a branch of government experiencing internal tension. It is a state within a state that has concluded the constitutional government is no longer the relevant authority structure. Now place this internal picture against what the IRGC is simultaneously doing externally at the Strait of Hormuz, because the constitutional seizure and the military strategy at the Strait are not separate decisions by the same organization. They are two dimensions of a single strategic logic that only becomes visible when you look at both simultaneously. The IRGC needs the war. Not in the abstract sense that institutions in conflict benefit from the conflict narrative that justifies their existence. In the specific, immediate, operational sense that the IRGC's seizure of state functions can only be sustained inside a framework of national emergency that makes constitutional norms temporarily suspendable in the name of survival. In peacetime, or in the aftermath of a negotiated settlement, every irregular appointment, every absorbed executive function, every constitutional fiction attributed to Mojtaba Khamenei's imaginary authority becomes a question that legal institutions, political factions, and eventually the Iranian public will demand be answered. In wartime, every question becomes a matter of priorities. We can address constitutional concerns after we survive. We cannot address constitutional concerns if we do not first survive the blockade, the strikes, the sanctions, the proxy network collapse, the economic crisis. The war is the IRGC's constitutional cover. The constitutional seizure is the IRGC's guarantee that no one inside the Iranian state can negotiate the war away without its permission. These two things are not parallel strategies. They are one strategy. Control the war, to control the peace, to control the state, and do all of it through a legitimacy vacuum that was created by the incapacitation of the one man whose authority could have stopped any of it. Foreign Minister Araki understood this clearly enough to do something that, in any functioning government, would be entirely routine, and that inside the current Iranian power structure constitutes an act of extraordinary political courage. He announced that Hormuz was open to commercial vessels. He was creating diplomatic space, signaling to international partners that the government was capable of offering something, beginning the process of separating Iran's official position from the IRGC's commercial targeting strategy that had been generating the international isolation sustaining the blockade. The IRGC's response was to open fire on tankers the same day Araki made his announcement. State television, which the IRGC controls through aligned personnel at every editorial level, called Araki stupid on air by name. A sitting foreign minister, publicly humiliated by the military organization he nominally helps govern, on state television while conducting official diplomatic functions on behalf of the state he represents. That is not a government experiencing internal tension. That is an organization that has concluded it no longer needs to maintain the fiction of governmental coherence because the institution that would enforce that fiction, the Supreme Leader's office, cannot function. And Pezeshkian, watching this happen to his foreign minister, made the decision that, within the context of the Islamic Republic, constitutes the most dangerous thing an elected official can do. He told the truth, not diplomatic truth, not managed truth delivered through layers of official framing. The actual truth about what the IRGC's strategy has produced. War damage at $270 billion, currency at its lowest point in history, steel, petrochemical, and energy infrastructure severely damaged. Isfahan's industrial zones struck. Port infrastructure degraded. The economy facing complete collapse within 3 weeks. And then the line that the IRGC understood immediately as a declaration of war against its institutional interests. The truth must be told to the people, otherwise trust in government will completely erode. You cannot tell the Iranian people the truth about what this war has cost without implicitly but unmistakably making the case that the organization whose strategy produced those costs should not be making the decisions about whether the war continues. Pezeshkian was not simply criticizing the IRGC's strategy. He was calling on the Iranian people to hold the organization responsible for consequences the organization was simultaneously claiming as justification for its expanded authority. The IRGC recognized what he was doing immediately, and its response was not to counter his argument. It was to accelerate the absorption of state functions in ways that make his argument irrelevant to the actual distribution of power. Because here is the critical asymmetry inside the current Iranian political structure that makes the IRGC's position stronger than it has any right to be given the catastrophic failure of its external strategy. Pezeshkian has the constitutional authority. Vahidi has the guns. In normal times, constitutional authority and coercive capacity are aligned through the Supreme Leader's office. The Supreme Leader authorizes the IRGC's command structure. The IRGC's command structure executes decisions authorized by the Supreme Leader. The civilian government operates within a framework that the Supreme Leader's authority makes legitimate, and the IRGC's coercive capacity makes enforceable. Remove the Supreme Leader from that chain, and you do not create a power vacuum in the abstract sense. You create a direct confrontation between the faction with constitutional authority and the faction with coercive capacity, with no institution capable of resolving the confrontation in favor of either. That confrontation is what is happening in Tehran right now. And it is happening against a backdrop that makes every dimension of it more dangerous and more likely to produce catastrophic outcomes. The Iranian military is not a unified institution. It never has been. And the fracture that was always latent between the IRGC and Artesh, the conventional military that the regime created the IRGC to counterbalance, has now reached the surface with a brutality that strips away every layer of official fiction. Frontline Artesh units under bombardment requested medical evacuation from IRGC forces operating in the same theater. The IRGC refused. Soldiers are dying of wounds that could be treated. The organization with functional medical infrastructure is watching them die and citing logistics. That decision, taken inside the command structure of a military organization that is simultaneously claiming to be the guardian of Iranian national survival, communicates something to every Artesh soldier in every unit across every front that no propaganda broadcast can contradict. The IRGC's commitment to Iran's survival extends precisely as far as the IRGC's institutional interests. Where those interests diverge from the survival of Artesh soldiers who did not choose to be part of the revolution's military elite, the institutional interests win. The soldiers can go without food. The soldiers can die of treatable wounds, The machine must be maintained. The people operating the machine are expendable. Frontline units are being issued 20 rounds of ammunition for 2 soldiers combined. An automatic weapon fires 10 rounds per second. The combined firepower of 2 soldiers lasts 2 seconds of sustained engagement. Units are operating without reliable drinking water. IRGC missile units are experiencing supply shortages and communication equipment failures. The command response has been revealing in its priorities. Technical components for missile system maintenance are delivered. Food and personal equipment for the soldiers operating those systems are not. And the result is the development that the regime's state television cannot report, and that every intelligence service watching Tehran is tracking as the most consequential military development in this entire crisis: mass desertion. Not individuals slipping away in the night, making private calculations. Groups, formations, soldiers abandoning positions and seeking refuge in nearby towns in numbers that constitute a military phenomenon rather than a disciplinary problem. Reserve mobilization was attempted. Most of those called up did not report. Some used the mobilization order as a signal to move their families toward border regions. The order designed to bring soldiers to the front produced civilians moving toward exits. The protest crowds are communicating directly with the soldiers who remain. The army is with the people, rising across dozens of cities simultaneously, directed at Artesh commanders. An invitation from the civilian population to the conventional military, the one the regime never trusted, the one treated as second class for 4 decades, to make a choice. Every Artesh officer hearing those chants is running a calculation the regime cannot monitor with sufficient precision to prevent. And the diplomatic faction understands this. Pezeshkian's team has been quietly exploring whether Artesh commanders can be aligned with the civilian government's position against the IRGC's power seizure. Not a coup in the traditional sense. An institutional realignment that would shift the internal balance of power away from Vahidi and toward the faction trying to negotiate an exit. The IRGC reads any Artesh movement toward the diplomatic faction as exactly what it is: a coup. And the IRGC's response to coup attempts is not proportionate. It is absolute. This is why Vahidi's acceleration of the constitutional seizure is happening now rather than later. Because the window in which the IRGC can consolidate sufficient control over state functions to prevent an Artesh realignment from mattering is closing. Every day, Pezeshkian remains in office making public statements about economic collapse. Every day, Arashi conducts diplomatic functions that signal an alternative Iranian position to international partners. Every day, Galibaf expresses fear of removal rather than support for escalation. Every day, the conventional military soldiers hear the crowd chanting that the army is with the people. These are not days that pass neutrally. They are days in which the probability of the institutional realignment the IRGC most fears increases. The succession question sits above all of this with a particular urgency that no faction has been willing to force into the open, but that the internal dynamics are now making impossible to avoid. The Assembly of Experts is the constitutional body responsible for selecting a new supreme leader if the incumbent is incapacitated or dies. It is a body of 88 clerics elected by the Iranian public with the authority to appoint, monitor, and remove the supreme leader. In theory, it is the constitutional check on supreme leader power that gives the Islamic Republic its claim to something more than pure clerical despotism. In practice, the Guardian Council, which the IRGC has significant influence over, vets all candidates for Assembly of Experts membership, ensuring that the body's composition reflects the interests of the revolutionary establishment rather than any genuine popular mandate. But the Assembly of Experts cannot simply ignore the succession crisis indefinitely. If Khamenei's incapacitation is complete, the constitutional process for selecting a successor should be underway. The fact that it is not underway, or that whatever process is happening is not visible to any external observer, tells you something important about who benefits from the ambiguity and who would be threatened by resolution. The IRGC benefits from the ambiguity in the most direct possible way. A functioning supreme leader would have the constitutional authority to tell Vahidi to return the executive functions he has seized to the civilian government. A functioning supreme leader would have the authority to authorize the nuclear deal that Pezeshkian's faction is trying to reach. A functioning supreme leader would have the authority to discipline IRGC commanders who fire on tankers the same day the foreign minister announces the strait is open to commercial traffic. A functioning supreme leader would be the load-bearing wall that the IRGC's constitutional coup requires to be absent in order to proceed. Every day the succession process does not formally begin is a day the IRGC retains the informal authority it has seized in the name of authorization it obtains from a constitutional ghost. The IRGC has every institutional incentive to ensure the succession question remains unresolved for exactly as long as the current crisis continues, because the moment a new supreme leader is formally installed, the fictional authority through which Vahidi has been governing collapses. Every irregular appointment becomes reversible. Every absorbed executive function becomes contestable with constitutional legitimacy, rather than just political argument. Every decision made in the name of Mojtaba Khamenei's informal authority becomes a decision made without authorization that the new supreme leader can simply reverse. The faction that controls the succession process controls everything that comes after it, and the IRGC understands this with a precision that its current behavior makes impossible to misread. There are three possible successors that Iranian political analysts and informed external observers have identified as the most likely outcomes of a formal succession process. Each one tells a different story about what the Islamic Republic becomes on the other side of the crisis. The first is Mojtaba Khamenei himself. The supreme leader's son has no significant clerical credentials that would qualify him constitutionally for the position. The Constitution requires that the supreme leader be a recognized religious jurist with the scholarly standing to issue religious rulings that the community of believers accepts as binding. Mojtaba does not have that standing in any serious clerical assessment. His elevation would represent a hereditary succession that transforms the Islamic Republic from a revolutionary theocracy into something closer to a dynastic monarchy, which would be ideologically catastrophic for the regime's own legitimacy narrative. And yet, the IRGC's behavior, its use of Mojtaba's informal authority as cover for its constitutional seizure, suggests that this is the outcome that serves IRGC institutional interests most directly. A supreme leader who inherited the position through family connection rather than religious merit, who has no independent political base, no clerical establishment loyalty, and no popular legitimacy, would be precisely the kind of figurehead that makes the IRGC the actual governing authority of Iran in a way that is constitutionally laundered rather than nakedly illegitimate. The second possible successor is a moderate clerical figure who would use the supreme leadership to reorient the Islamic Republic toward negotiated de-escalation. This is what Pezeshkian's faction wants. It is what the majority of the Iranian population, based on every piece of behavioral evidence available from the protest geography and the desertion rates and the fuel line arithmetic, would accept as a basis for social contract reconstruction. It is what Washington would find most compatible with the nuclear deal it is trying to reach. And it is the outcome the IRGC is working most urgently to prevent, because a moderate supreme leader with genuine clerical legitimacy would immediately reverse the constitutional seizure, authorize the nuclear deal, begin the process of reconstructing the civilian government's authority over IRGC economic operations, and ask the questions about why a military organization controls 30 to 40% of Iran's economy that only have uncomfortable answers inside the framework of permanent revolutionary struggle. The third possible successor is a hardline clerical figure fully aligned with the IRGC's institutional interests. This is Vahidi's preferred outcome, a supreme leader who provides genuine constitutional legitimacy to the decisions the IRGC has been making through fictional authorization, who authorizes the continuation of the war the IRGC needs to justify its existence, who validates the constitutional seizure retroactively rather than reversing it, and who gives the IRGC's economic empire the clerical cover it needs to continue operating without the questions that peacetime and a moderate supreme leader would inevitably generate. The problem with the IRGC's preferred succession outcome is that it requires an assembly of experts that the IRGC controls sufficiently to install its preferred candidate. And the assembly of experts, for all the IRGC's influence over its composition, contains enough clerical figures with independent standing and independent interests to make the outcome of a formal succession process genuinely uncertain. The IRGC can influence the process. It cannot guarantee the outcome, which is the deepest reason why Vahidi's strategy has been to avoid triggering the formal process at all, to govern through the legitimacy vacuum rather than resolve it, for exactly as long as the crisis conditions that justify emergency authority continue. This is what makes the 72-hour window real rather than rhetorical. Not the Chinese naval deployment at Hormuz, though that is also real and also running on a defined timeline, the internal succession timeline, because the economic clock is running regardless of the succession question. Oil storage is filling toward the capacity threshold beyond which well shutdowns become unavoidable and begin causing permanent geological damage. The currency is at historic lows. The fuel lines are getting longer. The protest geography is expanding into provincial cities that have never appeared in previous waves. The Artesh's institutional calculation about whether defending the regime is worth dying for is reaching a threshold that intelligence services monitoring it describe with the particular language reserved for genuinely dangerous moments. Every one of these processes is running on a timeline measured in days, and every one of them, if it reaches its threshold without a political resolution inside Tehran, produces an outcome that is categorically worse for every faction than the negotiated exits that are still theoretically available. Oil wells that shut down permanently degrade the asset base of the Iranian economy regardless of who is supreme leader after the crisis. An Artesh realignment that crosses from passive calculation to active institutional decision does not reverse cleanly because a new supreme leader is installed afterward. A protest wave that reaches the scale of the 2022 uprising at the fuel line conditions of the current crisis does not subside because a diplomatic announcement is made. These processes, once they reach certain thresholds, create facts on the ground that no political decision can simply undo. Outside Iran's borders, every actor with significant interests in the outcome of the succession question is watching and calculating without being willing to say publicly what they are calculating. China's quiet, its diplomatic engagement directed toward Riyadh rather than Tehran, its public statements prioritizing open navigation rather than Iranian survival reflect a strategic assessment that a post-succession Iran is a more stable commercial partner than the current fractured state. Beijing will not intervene in the succession process, but its assessment of which successor scenario is most compatible with Chinese commercial interests in the region is being communicated through the channels that the remaining functional elements of Iranian diplomacy can read. Russia, performing public solidarity while positioning to replace Iranian oil market share in Chinese markets, has its own assessment of the succession question that its performance of partnership does not reflect. A weakened Iran under a hardline IRGC-aligned supreme leader is a client state that serves Russian interests in ways that a competently governed moderate Iran does not. Russia's strategic preference for the succession outcome is not what its solidarity rhetoric suggests. The Gulf states, moving at maximum pace on the bypass pipeline infrastructure that will make Hormuz leverage permanently irrelevant, are watching the succession question with a specific concern that their public statements do not capture. A moderate successor who reaches a nuclear deal, reconstructs the civilian government's authority over IRGC economic operations, and begins the process of Iranian reintegration into regional economic relationships, is not the same strategic problem as a hardline IRGC-controlled figurehead who maintains the conflict narrative indefinitely. The Gulf states' infrastructure investment is being sized for the worst case, but their diplomatic engagement with the succession question, happening through channels that are not public, reflects an assessment of the range of possible outcomes and what each one means for regional stability over the next decade. The Iranian people are not asking the succession question as a matter of political analysis, they are asking it as a matter of daily survival. The fuel lines are the succession question translated into human experience. The empty gas stations in an oil-producing country are the succession question expressed in the terms that matter to the population that will ultimately determine whether whatever political structure emerges from this crisis has the legitimacy to function. Every Iranian standing in a fuel line is making an assessment about whether the regime that told them their sacrifices were necessary for regional dominance deserves their compliance. And the assessment that fuel line arithmetic produces is not favorable to any faction that has governed Iran for the past 45 years, because all of them, including Pezeshkian's reform faction, have been part of a system whose choices produced the fuel lines. The 2009 uprising came from a stolen election. The 2019 wave came from a gasoline price increase. The 2022 movement came from a young woman dying in custody. Each was triggered by a specific visible injustice that crystallized accumulated grievance into organized protest. The conditions today are heavier than all three combined. Military defeat that every deserting soldier makes visible. Economic collapse that every fuel line makes visible. Constitutional crisis that every IRGC appointment made without presidential authorization makes visible. And above all of it, the absence of the figure whose authority the entire system required to function, creating a legitimacy vacuum that both the crisis and the IRGC are filling in ways that the Iranian population can see and that state television cannot explain away. Here's the picture as it actually stands. The supreme leader of the Islamic Republic cannot exercise his constitutional authority. The constitutional process for resolving that incapacitation has not been formally triggered because the faction that controls the coercive apparatus of the state benefits from the ambiguity more than from any available resolution. The IRGC is governing through a fictional authority chain attributed to a man with no constitutional standing. Using emergency conditions, it is simultaneously sustaining through a military strategy whose external failure it will not acknowledge. The civilian government has the constitutional authority to demand a different course and lacks the coercive capacity to enforce that demand. The conventional military is approaching the institutional threshold at which its soldiers' calculation shifts from passive disengagement to active realignment with the civilian population asking it to choose. The economy has days, not weeks, before processes begin that cause permanent structural damage regardless of what political decisions follow. The protests are at a scale and geographic distribution that the regime's suppression architecture was not designed to contain, and every external actor with interests in the outcome is calculating quietly in ways that benefit none of them from the current state of suspended resolution. The IRGC made a move that nobody was supposed to see as a single coherent strategy. It has been seen, It is a constitutional coup executed through a legitimacy vacuum, sustained by a fictional authority chain, justified by a military crisis whose continuation the coup requires, and directed at preventing the succession process that would install the load-bearing wall that could stop it. The audacity of it, the clarity of its institutional logic, and the completeness of its execution are genuinely impressive as exercises in organizational power seizure. The question that every intelligence service, every government, and every faction inside Iran is now asking is whether the IRGC has moved fast enough and consolidated deeply enough to make its position unassailable before the convergence of economic collapse, military desertion, conventional military realignment, and popular uprising reaches the threshold at which the consolidated position stops mattering because the structure it was designed to control no longer exists. That answer is being determined right now, in the space between the fuel lines and the command rooms, between the soldiers who did not report for reserve mobilization and the generals running the calculation about whose side they are actually on, between the constitutional ghost and the organization using its imaginary authority to govern a nuclear-adjacent state in the most dangerous conditions the Islamic Republic has ever faced. The supreme leader is gone in every functional sense that matters. The IRGC just made a move that everybody in Tehran can see and nobody with constitutional authority can stop. And the next move belongs to the only actor left whose decision the IRGC cannot control, absorb, or govern through fictional authorization: the Iranian people, who are in the fuel lines, doing the arithmetic, and whose patience is running out faster than the oil storage is filling. Something historic is being decided in Tehran. Not at the negotiating table, not in the Strait, not in any room where the people making the decisions have titles that appear in constitutional documents. In the space between what the regime claims and what every Iranian can see from the fuel line. That space has never been wider, and the decisions made inside it in the hours and days ahead will determine not just who runs Iran after this crisis ends, they will determine whether the institution that has governed Iran since 1979 survives the crisis in any form that can still be called governance. The IRGC thought the legitimacy vacuum was its opportunity. It may have been its trap.